Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Pam Greensky. I'm the Director of Operations here at Advisicon, and I'd like to welcome you all to today's webinar, How to Use Microsoft Project to Create Float, Slack, and Buffers with Waterfall or Agile projects. A quick summary of who we are at Advisicon. We're a group of authors, teachers, consultants, and technologists that are passionate about helping organizations learn, scale, and grow with a mix of methodology and technology to deliver results. No matter your company's size, our team specializes in maximizing your business and personal productivity by leveraging the Microsoft technology experience. We offer biweekly webinars, which here at Advisicon we refer to as Webinar Wednesdays, in which we spend 30 minutes or an hour teaching topics ranging from Microsoft Project, Project Server, Project Online, Power BI, Visio, SharePoint, to project, program, and portfolio management and methodology approaches. With attending any of our weekly webinars, you will receive free PDUs. Today's webinar, How to Use Microsoft Project to Create Float, Slack, and Buffers with Waterfall or Agile projects, you will receive a half PDU. Before we get started, you'll notice that, up in the top right of your screen, you should have a control panel. On that control panel, that's where you have the option to adjust your volume, your screen settings, and other settings that would be helpful during the presentation. And the audience is muted during this presentation, so in order to ask questions, you'll have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenter by typing your questions into the questions or chat pane of the control panel. You can send your questions at any time during the presentation, and we'll collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. And it's now my pleasure to introduce the presenter of today's webinar, Tim Runcie, a Microsoft MVP for more than 14 consecutive years, and most importantly, Advisocon's president and owner. Go ahead, Tim.
Thanks, Pam. Welcome, everyone, to Webinar Wednesday. Happy to have you here today. Our topic around buffers, float, and Slack using Microsoft Project has been kind of an ongoing discussion, and it's actually interesting that there is a lot of legacy and history around how do you plan, how do you add buffers. So what I wanted to do is do a little bit of a blend of both the methodologies that approach how to manage and utilize that not only just in project management, program, or portfolio planning, but really also tactically down to projects. So I'm going to show you some tips, tricks, and shortcuts in the tool, which should be fun. Again, getting into really what issues that project managers and PMOs run into when using float, Slack, or buffers, and kind of defining that. And then we'll talk about whether it's Agile or Waterfall or a blend between the two. But overall, I want to make sure that you guys have a chance to look at some of the opportunities to manage that and do that inside of your own technology. Specifically, I'll be using Microsoft Project today. So before I get started, it's always nice to define what is buffer or float or Slack. And in many cases, individuals will mix these terms all together, but they really in many cases are separate. Now, because of the length of time, I don't want to make this an 8-hour class on buffers, float, and Slack. I'm going to kind of narrowly focus some of the time and energy that we'll be showcasing here. But think of it this way. A buffer really is some sort of a contingency for either planned or inexperienced in estimating. It's kind of a risk factoring that a lot of organizations will use. In fact, in some cases, even when we require estimates, people are starting to pad or put some sort of a buffer on their estimate. And again, if we talk about float and Slack in its pure form, usually float or Slack is the amount of time that you have between the end of a task, and if you're thinking about critical path, which is the amount of time that you have perhaps between it makes a task go from critical. In many cases, you guys are all working on critical path, which means everything is pretty much impacting the end date of the project. So in many organizations, those words buffer, float, Slack, how much wiggle room do we have are kind of munched together. So I'm going to focus a little bit not just on the earned value or critical path planning around float or Slack. I want to talk about how we provide that level of flexibility in securing our estimates. Now, it's important to note that buffers are good. Float and Slack is important to plan into your project. It helps you address risks that come up that you can't see. You'll also get into a place that in terms of setting buffers or estimates is that it's a learning experience. So you're managing those expectations of your technical team, your business team, your sponsors, in some cases even the vendors or suppliers. Many cases, if you're thinking in terms of fixed price deliverables, this is where you absolutely have to factor in some time around that. So if you are on a hard fixed price deliverable, then having a padding in there or a buffer is important to make sure you do that. Now we'll talk about reasons for doing it and not doing it as well. But overall, it's important to make sure that you have an understanding of what deliverables will be delivered and kind of when that schedule is. What's also important around understanding how to use buffers or float or slack is that you want to be able to predict and forecast, right? Is there something I should be able to see in the future, or hey, when I communicate a deadline, I've put in enough contingency to make sure I do meet expectations. And so we'll talk about managing up as well as managing down in terms of putting that together within your project program or portfolio task planning. Now, in general, project managers, resource managers, functional managers, and in many cases, even project management offices or authority groups that kind of are standardizing, they really have and struggle with buffers. And I'm going to talk about that because if you haven't already experienced this, is that if you give an individual or a team a certain amount of time, then typically with that time that they're given, that's exactly what they take to deliver. In fact, you hear the term work expands to fit the schedule. Basically, the idea is that if you have a date, you'll get it done right at the end of that due date. So inherently, if you are thinking about back in the old, if you've been in college, you've had tests to take, when did you turn in your term paper? You didn't turn it in a week early. Usually you're working on it because you had a period of time that you were able to kind of manage, but it had a deliverable or a due date. And so even though you might be getting padded estimates or you're adding some sort of a buffer, in many cases this actually erodes or it basically puts a risk factor on trust, because if I'm always being told one thing and then it's something different, you start to kind of question, what is that buffer? Are you padding those activities? When I talk to a technical resource or a developer, what they'll be doing is giving me what I want to hear, or are they telling me what I need to hear? And this is part of culture. As you begin thinking about using both technology to validate estimates to baseline or what I forecasted, it really helps to speed that process. But again, it's really important that whether you're adding or cutting the budget, if your technical teams are adding buffers and then you're removing them, you have kind of this erosion going back and forth. And ultimately, we want to roll up our metrics to see if we're over or under. And so the ability of an organization to move through its maturity curve is so important, being able to say, listen, I need visibility to what those buffers or that padding actually is. And again, remember, we have to manage upward, and in some cases we have to manage outward, meaning we're talking to our customers, we're talking to stakeholders, we might be managing up to executives. So the idea is that extra time, certainly if you're adding it, does not guarantee successful delivery of an item, a feature, a user story, a task, or even a project. So just because you're adding buffers does not necessarily mean it's going to make that successful. The idea is to find a balance between these. So the idea of applying or combining both good practices and methodology, having visibility to metrics, whether it's coming from Microsoft Project or scheduling technology, are all helpful to work with. Now, I get a lot of questions from time to time that says, is there a difference between waterfall buffers and agile buffers? And in many cases, if you're thinking in terms of waterfall, you have a series of phases that you move through. And inherently, a lot of times we'll be discovering new scope and we'll be comparing that against what was planned. You might create the term parking lots. You have people putting things in terms of planning that says, hey, this is on the backlog. And then as we start rolling deeper into Agile, you're here, hey, listen, it's not part of the Kanban board, but we're going to capture it over here. And whether you're doing Post-it notes or stickies, or you really do have a technical tool, putting the backlog in there. The idea is that we're creating a list of activities, prioritizing, and figuring out if we can do those. Now, the overall idea is that if we're talking about blending a buffer within a waterfall environment, there's approaches to do that. However, in an agile process, a lot of that discussion actually surfaces in, how long do you think this will take? What is that level of effort that it will be to deliver that? How complex is this? And so you hear the term story points. So Agile is actually, in many cases, whether you're using Scrum or one of the other Agile disciplines, is that they really do a better job, and in many cases, surfacing what are true estimates, having team members work together to kind of factor what that might be. However, capturing, identifying, and pulling things out of scope, or capturing, identifying a risk factor, there are different approaches to put that together. So whether it's Waterfall or Agile, if you're using Microsoft Project, you're going to find that you're going to pick up a lot of the exact same tips and tricks regardless of the methodology that you're working with. So if you're in more of a hybrid where you're doing more of a Scrum or Fall or maybe a Agile environment, meaning that you've got maybe embedded Agile processes within an overall phased approach, you might be mixing both, but Microsoft Project is a database. It'll allow you to kind of surface, track, and make a lot of this visible. And we'll talk about that here in a few minutes. Okay, so as we talk about getting into it, let's actually take a look at exactly what we're referring to. So let me hop in and bring up good old Microsoft Project. And I'm going to start here with just an overall schedule. Now what I've done here is I've created a phased approach. You can see here I've got sort of a waterfall schedule. We're moving through a series of life cycles or perhaps a work breakdown structure. And then I have broken into here a series of sprints. Now, whether you're doing these as releases or epics or features or user stories or however your hierarchy is, a summary task can be labeled anything, but ultimately we have the ability to say, where do we capture and manage some of those activities? So in some cases where we're looking at our overall, our float and our buffers, you'll find that task, for example, row 28 here, where it says feature 15, maybe we can't get this done. Where do we put the extra activities or the work or the task information? Well, that normally in an Agile process gets called out and moved to the backlog. And again, it'll be estimated and reprioritized as you move through that process. So in many cases, you literally could be breaking off a row, dragging and dropping it, or moving it between there. However, the idea of including what we call story points is helpful. So the idea is that if I'm working in an environment and I really do want to add a series of story points, I can look for a complexity factor. And again, whether I'm using an enterprise field or a local field, whether it's project online or project server, isn't going to matter. Some organizations will use the opportunity to use a complexity factor or a risk ranking. And again, the overall idea is, whether it's Agile or even in Waterfall, is that if I go in here to a field that might be a text value that's a lookup that allows me to put what the state might be, or perhaps I might be looking at an overall risk ranking, is that whether you're calling it low, medium, or high, or saying it's small, medium, or large, or you have some sort of a buffer that just says I want to capture the numbers of a low, a medium, or high, all of these things you can add. Now what I'm going to be doing is showing you ways to manage that as well, but there's something I want to specifically show you that allows you to tackle buffers, whether you're putting them in a sprint or whether you're capturing them in a waterfall plan. So let me open a few of these up, and you can see as I open up my schedule, I've kind of highlighted what I call at the end of a task, what we refer to as a buffer. Let me zoom this real quickly so you can see this. The idea is that if we think about lean estimating, meaning that we're thinking about critical chain or critical planning, is that I want to surface estimates as accurately as possible, right? We want to get to a single source of truth. And so if you're interviewing your technical resources, it may be a little more of an art and a science that says, well, how long is this going to take? And they say, well, this will take 5 weeks. And you go, 5 weeks, how confident are you? You know, can you give me a low or medium or high? And you begin to have this dialogue of asking questions. Well, one of the approaches that we find very successful is that if you want to certainly capture a range of time, if everyone knows that if you've been given 4 days or 10 days to deliver something, work will expand to fit the schedule. So what we'll do is say, listen, I need you to give me the lean estimate. And we think in terms of critical chain is that if you're looking at what will it take to deliver the activities that you're working on, if we have a lean estimate, what we want to do is see what those lean estimates are, and we'll certainly baseline those, right? We can come up here and say, hey, listen, I want to showcase what my baseline might be. And so I can grab my hours, my work, and my cost. However, what I don't want to do is pad each and every task. What I'll do here, in fact, let me turn off the baseline, is that I can go in and add a buffer activity. Now, whether you want to add a buffer for the entire project, or if you want to put a buffer at the end of each phase or at the end of each sprint, the overall idea is that a buffer is something that just says, before I start the next series of activities, I have a block of time that I'm working with. So overall, if every task was estimated to have a low or a high, what we're going to find is that if we get our low estimates and we take a look at our high estimates, we certainly can create a buffer task. But what we want to do is make that buffer or make that float or slack or that kind of padding that people put there, make it visible. Now, most organizations that deal with executives, the first thing you'll have is a CEO or a CTO or a CIO come back and go, get rid of all those buffers. I don't want to see any buffers in here. And in many cases, as we're helping to set up PMOs, I've had this conversation over and over again. It's like, do you really want to do that? You need to see where the buffers are. You want to see where that float is actually being padded to an activity. Because if you don't, it will get buried and you will never know. That means when a technical resource tells me it's a week, they know it's going to be a couple days, but they put their own padding on there. I get it as maybe the project manager. I add my padding. I throw that up to my program manager, my sponsor. They add their padding. The executive goes to the customer, or the sales rep goes to the customer, and they've added their padding. And what we've done is we've padded ourselves out of a job or out of a contract, or we really don't have an accurate estimate. So what we want to do is surface that and not beat people up for having padding there, is we want to make it visible. Now here's the cool thing. If everyone is estimating leanly and you've got your buffer padded here, what'll happen as you begin to progress your work, people are making sure they're trying to get their work done in the leanest estimate. Now we know things may slip off or on. However, this buffer will start to disappear. For example, if this takes 2 more days, what I will see is, hey, listen, I've just moved beyond this. I get a little bit of a visual cue here. Sometimes we'll even put deadlines. My buffer notices that, hey, look, I've got to have to, because I've set this as a manual task, that I'm going to have to adjust this in order to make sure that it will move or keep the dates that we have here. And the idea is that everyone in an organization will start to watch the buffers. That means when I get the database or the DBAs involved, they may realize that, hey, the planning phase, we ate up one of the days of the buffer. And so I may have to shorten the overall duration here in order to make sure that I'm going to meet my original schedule. Again, this is a great place that if you have your baseline turned on, you can see where you've gone over or under with your time. And again, in terms of us respecting our links, we understand that, hey, listen, I may want to go through and manually adjust this, but I can actually see, hey, I'm eating at my buffer. And what will happen as an organization is that everyone will start to watch the buffers. And that's really important, is that everyone's thinking that, hey, listen, I'm going to give it to the DBAs, but we've eaten up some of their buffer. They don't get the same buffer anymore. They're going to have to reduce theirs in order to make this schedule. And so as you use deadlines to showcase whether you're ahead or behind, the idea is surfacing that information and making visible with a task is quite an easy task or an activity to do in Microsoft Project. Now, there's some other things that you can do that I think you might find very interesting. And I want to wrap up with a little bit more technical kind of ways to make the tool do some work for you. And the idea is that if we want to surface a buffer, maybe make sure that we can see what it is or have it maybe auto-adjust, we've got some activities that we can put together to make that happen. But again, whether you're doing one large buffer at the end of your project or you do it by phase, and by setting them to manual, it forces people to adjust or give up that time in order to make that schedule. And so organizations begin to estimate leanly. They work to lean estimates, but they know they have a little bit of padding or buffer, but they're also monitoring the fact that their buffer is disappearing. So if a group runs over, it's a very clear conversation that says, you guys ate up all of our buffer. What are we going to do? So again, having some of that, making it visible, allows you to manage and estimate a little better and improve your culture in terms of looking at how much flexibility of float, slack that you have. Now I'm going to show you a little trick here. I don't think a lot of people know about this, so I'm going to just show you another way that you can possibly manage work and work activities. So I'm going to show you how to build it, and then I'm going to show you a file here in just a moment that's already put together. But watch this. If I have a whole bunch of work that needs to get done, and that's going to take about 5 days. And let's just pretend that that is a very detailed schedule, linked activities, summary tasks, etc. We can go through here and we can actually make all of that visible. So here it is. I've got an auto-scheduled activity, 5 days, and assuming that's a schedule. Now I'm going to add a milestone here. I'm going to call this the critical path end, right? So this is the end of kind of all the work activities. And what I'll do here is I'm just going to link these two together. So pretend whether you have 10 rows or 1,000 rows is you've got a schedule. Now, what I may have is in some large organizations, I have a drop dead date that I need to get it done by. And so what I try not to do is hard code dates here, but if you really want to watch how much flexibility that you have with this, you can do a couple things. Let me skip down a row here and I'll show you this. If this is our critical, I'll just call this the key delivery date. I'm going to make this a milestone. And I'm going to force this to actually have a constraint. So again, constraints on a living dynamic schedule are very annoying. You don't want to have them there. But if I come in here and I say, you know what, this is kind of my end date I need to watch. Even though I might have flexibility to ebb and flow and slip, I'm going to force this task to be must finish on. And then why don't we schedule that to be finished on, say, the 21st? Okay, there we go. So if you're looking closely, I've got a milestone at the end here. I've kind of got my schedule, and it looks like I got a little bit of float or slack, or I've got a bit of a buffer that I can work with. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a buffer task here. And this buffer task is designed for us to make sure that if I want to watch or make this visible, I want it to dynamically adjust. Now, you notice that my task type here, which I just double-clicked on that row, brought up the task information box, says fixed duration. I'm going to go ahead and just make this fixed work or fixed units. Usually the default is fixed units, but I have mine set to fixed duration because I really do try and manage to a schedule. Now, what we're going to refer to is the ability to hammock activities. So what I'm really saying is that the finish of my critical task end here, let me just go ahead and copy this. I'm going to come over here and I'm going to paste it. I'm not going to link it. I'm going to paste it with a paste special, paste link, and I'm going to click on OK. Is I'm going to say, hey, listen, the end date of my critical path activities leads right to the end of my buffer task. I want to kind of watch that buffer. However, what I want to do is take the end date here, and if I copy this, and I right click here on the finish date, is I'm going to say, regardless of what happens, I'm going to do a paste special and paste link. I want the activity to render itself between 2 points in time. Again, hey, this is building upon a concept called hammocking. The idea is that, hey, the finish, or at least the end date of our critical path tells me when my buffer begins. And then I have kind of this hard stop or an end period that says I want to link it there. But in project, of course, you can only link to a start or a finish. But in this case, we've kind of done a paste special, paste link. And the overall idea is that if your project takes longer, we can actually watch that buffer disappear. We can make it shrink, and we can make it expand. So let me take you to a file where I've already put that together. But if you like that concept, there's a lot of fun you can do with it. So let me kind of wrap into our more advanced technical piece here. Let me bring an example of this over. So if you take a peek here, I've got the same thing embedded where I've got a series of activities that lead to a milestone. I've got a buffer task. I've got an end date. And again, the overall idea is if I wanted to kind of tell me how we're doing by moving up or down, you'll notice that in this case, it's telling me how much of my buffer is left. Notice there's a little percent there. So I'm going to show you some things you can do to help make this a little bit more visually appealing, as well as our ability to make sure that you've got some functionality there. So first off, let's look at a couple elements. Number one, I'm going to switch over to my buffer table, and I'm going to show you the moving parts that I put in here. Number one, I've added a flag field column that allows me to say, hey, listen, I want to see a buffer task and I want to make it look differently. And by making a flag field, I can just toggle it from yes to no, and it goes back to a plain looking task to something that says, oh, nope, that's a buffer activity. Second, as I'm going through here, it's nice to render what the overall duration might be. And again, if you think about that, you might even be in a position where you're doing a start and a finish, but you may even want to say, well, what is that range? What is that early start or late finish? In my case, I call it best start and or worst finish. And I may want to do a calculation there. So if we want to look at the buffer amount, what I will do is, by the way, if you're interested in this, I encourage anyone to reach out to me for some of the templates that we demo. I'm happy to share those with you. So send us an email and we'll actually send the actual file over so you don't have to rewrite all these formulas. But if I come in here and say, hey, here's my buffer task, it tells me what is that buffer amount. And I look at the formula. What I simply did is said, hey, listen, if the flag 1 field, which is this column on the left, is yes, then I kind of want to round the duration. And really what I'm doing is taking the duration and I'm dividing it by baseline duration. So as long as they're on track, I can kind of see a 1 for 1 should always return 1. And of course, I multiply it times 100 because I want to see it in a percentage. And basically, I've kind of appended the percent symbol with a little bit of a space so I can see that. Now, the idea is that as I'm looking at that baseline, which I have snapped up here for my project, is that as I'm going through and making changes or updating that schedule, the baseline is actually comparing itself with how much it had originally to what's left over. And that's the beautiful thing about having a nice little display there, is as I increase or shorten my schedule, I can see how much is left or how much I'm using up. So you can do calculations around that. As well as showcasing that, let's just talk about bar styles. If you want to render visualization of that, I'll just come out here and right-click and go to bar styles. And what I did here is I added a row called buffer task. I just inserted a row, and I made it look where I have a little beginning of an end, and I put a end symbol at the far right end in the beginning, and I chose a shape in the middle. And of course, because I have a field where I was doing the calculation, I can go to the text value and say, I want to put the buffer amount field here. That's where it's getting that percent display. Now, what's nice about this is that I can actually go through and say, hey, listen, it's a normal task, but I'm using flag 1. In fact, if I scroll through here, you'll see that you can actually make activities appear differently based upon a flag. And that's why, if I cancel out of here, we've added this flag field that just says, hey, I want to quickly show the visual buffers themselves. Now, if you want to get fancy with this, if you start with what we call a best start or a worst finish, which maybe takes the start date field, in this case, I just took start 1, added a formula, and just said, hey, take the start date and give me a 2-day window. If I can start a little bit sooner, that's a plus. Same with the finish date. I could come in and say, hey, take our finish and go ahead and put a formula that just says, take the end date, add 2, add a percentage. You can do divisional math. I don't want to get too fancy there, but the overall idea is that if you notice that my start date is on 4/4, my best start might be 2 days sooner, maybe a Sunday, maybe not. But what I like to see in the bar styles is that as I'm dealing with my buffers or showcasing the planning effort, is that I can come in here and say, hey, listen, let's go ahead and add, let's add an activity here. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to call this best start. And I'm just going to say, you know what, it's going to be normal, but not flag 1. And that's a little bit of a trick here, is that you can actually type not and it will exclude those. However, its start is going to be, can you guess? It will be, whoops, B-E-S-T, so I can spell it right here, B-E-S-T, best start. So I'm just going to say, hey, listen, why don't we make that green? I want to see some sort of a nice green visualization that says, hey, what is my best start? And when I click on OK, I can see, hey, potentially, this is where we may be having an early start. The blue in the middle right on top of it is showing, hey, normally that's what's going to happen. And if I right-click again and go to bar styles, add another one here, and we'll just call this worst finish. Same thing here. It's going to be normal, but just like a normal task, but I don't want to include the flag 1 because flag 1 I'm showing my buffer. However, its finish date is going to be not just the regular finish, it's going to be the worst finish. Of course, that's not a happy thing, so let's make it a bright flaming red. Click on OK. And what you're able to do is look at your early starts, your late finishes, your buffers, and you can have it actually make adjustments as your schedule goes forward or backwards. Again, whether you're putting this at the task level or a final buffer task, you've got some good flexibility there. So I know I can go a lot deeper here, but I hope this is helpful in terms of giving you some ammunition to work with. Let me flip back over to our PowerPoint, and then let's just wrap up with a couple things here, and then I will take some questions. So again, it's important to think about your buffers, right? Capture them, make them visible. Don't bury them. Don't let your team bury them. We definitely want to work to expand to the lean estimate, but possibly get the ability to build trust, get something that says I can measure, or reward people for doing well, staying close to their lean estimates. Again, there's other elements that you'll be able to put in here, and I've given some examples in the technology itself. But Pam, are there any questions I can take from our audience today?
Okay, Tim. Well, looking at the chat window, I've got one question here for you. It looks like someone's typing a second here. First question, are there any risks to using hammock tasks?
That's a great question. Okay, let's talk about that. So one of the things, remember that hammock task is that ability to copy into a paste special paste link. So do note that it does take a little while for it to render. Sometimes if you have a whole lot of those, it takes a while for your calculations to adjust based on what's happening. Another element is that if you are going to be using Project Server or Project Online, you cannot actually see or make changes to a hammock task. It's going to break it. So as long as you're not editing that hammock task in PWA, you can use the desktop tool to be fine with. The other element is, remember, I added this kind of end date target milestone. In this case, this would potentially break my critical path planning because I threw this activity out there. Now you notice here I didn't keep these directly within the summary task. I actually kind of created the buffer outside and the project end date. But if critical task planning or letting projects calculation of critical path is important to you, I recommend that if you go to File and Options that you may want to use multiple critical paths, which you can do. That way you can see obviously the overall critical path to maybe a high level, you can't miss this date, but at the same time allowing your schedule to ebb and flow and showing a secondary critical path, which are the activities that lead up to really this deliverable, not your buffer deliverable, but really the activity here. That's a great question, Pam. Other questions?
Okay, just one here. Let me try to reword this a little bit. Lean estimating or critical chain estimating with project, has this approach been successful?
Okay. So remember, I came back here and I talked about certainly in an agile approach, you can kind of break down capturing things in the backlog, or perhaps maybe at the end of a sprint is that you want to put some sort of a padding. Whether that padding's a column that just says, what is our low or our high hours, work, or cost, you've got some flexibility. The short answer to that question is absolutely. In fact, if you go and work at manufacturing or silicon, if you talk about Intel, we've actually seen huge success in helping organizations begin to think leanly, give lean estimates, but not be afraid to surface, hey, you know what, there's a risk factor here. I need to make sure that risk factor is known, but let's make it visible. So putting it on the table has actually been fairly freeing for technical teams. What I find sometimes the hardest that's been is convincing executives not to go and basically shoot all of the buffer. They need to be able to understand that the team is making it visible. No, you don't get to remove it from them, otherwise they're going to go bury it back in the schedule. But it has been helpful in helping organizations mature in their schedule management techniques. Okay, Pam, any other questions?
No, but I just have a few requests on here that some people would like some templates sent out after the webinar, so I'll forward those to you.
Wonderful. And again, if you like what you're seeing here, we'd love to share. It's always fun. There's some amazing little formulas out there. But as a project program and portfolio organization, this is just where we take that whole blending of both methodology and technology. So very happy to share. And again, if you're watching this in the webcast and YouTube later on, feel free to reach out to us. Okay, Pam, let me kind of wrap up with our summary and I'll hand it back to you. So in general, think about, making visible your buffers, right? Call them out. Now, you don't have to have a buffer activity, but Slack or float, it's nice to see. But if you're doing lean estimating or you're setting your baselines, you may even want in the schedule to show the customer, hey, here's kind of our worst estimate. And we may not call it worst. We may just call it this is the finish date. But the idea is that you have it and it's visible. So you don't have to go and take the data out and massage it in Excel and share it with somebody. You can control what views show up and what columns you're naming it by. So the overall idea is that if, hey, look, I'm going to actually say this is kind of where we think the leanest start might be, but ultimately we may want to add a little bit of time. And if we're going to communicate with the schedule, use a finish date that actually represents perhaps that buffer of time, but ultimately you know what that lean estimate is. And again, you have plenty of options to play with. So again, keep it simple. And basically, if you put a lot of this stuff in here, you'll have to spend a little more time monitoring it. But I do like using manual tasks for buffers because it forces you to go and physically relinquish that time. I do like using the auto calculation buffers at the end if I do a very large overall buffer. But the idea is that you've got some options to play with. All right. Well, Pam, let me hand this back to you. And again, thank you, everyone. If you need more or if you have more questions, feel free to reach out to us anytime. But Pam, I'll turn it back over to you.
Oh, thank you, Tim. And again, I learn something new every time. So thank you so much for this webinar, Tim. And thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. We always welcome your questions, suggestions, and we just want your feedback. So for more information or to request any templates, please contact Tim Runcie or Pam Greensky. And just so you know, once you exit today's webinar, you'll receive a survey on the presentation, and we would appreciate it if you would complete and submit the survey in order to get your PDUs. You'll also receive a follow-up email, usually on Friday, with a link to review today's webinar and also with all of your PDU information. So on behalf of AdvisoCon, Tim and myself, thank you for joining us today, and we hope to see you participate in future webinars. Have a great rest of your Wednesday.
Thanks, everyone.